en
Click
la
on the
barra inferior de
interpretation
la ventana de
icon
Zoom
in the
y
lower
haga clic.
toolbar of Zoom screen
Seleccione el
and
idioma
click
en el que quiere oír el
Select
evento.
the English in which you
Seleccione Off
prefer
si
to
quiere
listen to
oír
the
el
event
evento en
in,
el idioma
and
original.
choose
Si
off
tiene algún
if you want to
problema
hear
con la
the event in
herramienta,
its
puede
original
escribir en el
language. If
chat
you have
y le
any technical
atenderemos.
problems with
Las
the module,
preguntas
please write
hechas
through the
por el
chat and
chat
we will
tendrán
assist you.
menos posibilidad de ser
Questions
atendidas.
made through the
Por
chat
favor,
will have less
ubique el
probabilities of
botón de
being answered.
Q&A,
So please
preguntas y
click on the
respuestas,
Q&A
en la parte
module,
inferior de la ventana de
also
Zoom
in the
y
lower
escriba
toolbar
su
Zoom,
pregunta.
and
Haremos
write down
todo
your
lo
question.
posible por contestar
We
el
will make
mayor
our
número de
best to
preguntas.
try to answer to the
Muchas
highest
gracias
number of
por
questions possible.
acompañarnos.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Les presentamos a Rosita Caro,
We'd like to
fundadora y
introduce
directora
Rosita
del colegio
Caro,
Hacienda
founder and
Los
director
Alcaparros.
of the Hacienda Los Alcaparros School. Good day, good morning, Juan, good morning to all the community, the tech community that is joining us today in the framework of the celebration of the Creative Brain event from the Brain Initiative that Colegio Los Alcaparros School has led. Today we have, I think, the deepest and most interesting conference about this in this process. It's now the fifth conference, and we will talk about, together with Juan Miguel Lavista, about a topic that perhaps will solve many of the paradoxes that have been present in education as of the presentation that we had during the COVID-19 pandemic, and in the way in which it forced us to have a learning curve in technology matters. And now, being at the end of the process, finding ourselves with perhaps not really knowing what to do with children and screen time, Juan has had a broad and very important experience in terms of data and human development, also in data usage for the evaluation of ideas and determining the values that these ideas have to be able to really respond to human problems. Technology, together with a process that is absolutely humane and the development of humankind. He manages several projects of AI, artificial intelligence, AI for humanitarian action, and he currently works, or he carries out most of his work in Microsoft as one of the CEOs of Microsoft, and therefore it's a pleasure for us to have Juan Lavista from the Microsoft AI for Good Research Lab in terms and talking about technology and the humanities. Thank you very much, Juan, for being with you. I really don't want to extend, so please go ahead. Great, thank you, Rosa.
Well, thanks, everyone. Every time we open a newspaper, we find amazing stories about the power of data, machine learning, and AI. Of course, only this is partially true, partially hype, and a huge amount of jargon. The first question I have today is, why do we have so much jargon? And this happens for two reasons. The first one is we are addicted to complicated projects. We like complicated things. This is the reason we put a man on the moon before we added wheels to your luggage. The second reason is because we want to look sophisticated. And there's nothing better to looking sophisticated to creating your own jargon. When you go to Starbucks, instead of small, medium, and large, we need to order our coffee tall, grande, and venti. Even though Starbucks have been using these coffee sizes for over 15 years, people still go online and search for the meaning of these coffee sizes. So this desire to look sophisticated plus our addiction to complicated projects leads to jargon. Jargon leads to confusion. The first lesson I want to share is, if you want to impress people, your solutions can be complicated. But if you want to have an impact on this world, your solution needs to be simple. And simple solutions are hard. What is an idea? Well, if you go to the definition of the dictionary, it's not clear. Like everybody understands what is an idea, but if you ask someone to describe it, it's not easy. And if you go to the dictionary, there's a lot of variance on what is an idea. One thing that I like from Percy is that to understand an idea clearly, we should ask ourselves what difference its application would make to our evaluation of a proposed solution to the problem at hand. He looks at ideas as a way to solve problems. And that's one of the definitions I actually like. But then we have two types of problems. We have complex problems and we have complicated problems. And complicated and complex are very different things, even though if you go to a dictionary today, you will see that one is kind of a synonym to the other one. If you ask a physicist, this is not the case. Complicated and complex are actually very different. And I think it's important to distinguish between the two. A complicated problem is sending a rocket to the moon. A complex problem is raising children. There's very different types. These are two very different tasks, and how you approach them also are very different. In the case of sending a rocket to the moon, we need rigid protocols or formulas are needed. In the case of children, rigid protocols have limited application or are counterproductive. You should try, but it doesn't work. Sending a rocket increases the likelihood that the next will also be a success. As a father of three, I can tell you that raising one child provides experience, but it's not guarantee at all of success with the next one. High level of expertise in the case of rockets and training in a variety of fields are necessary for success. Expertise in raising children helps, but only when balanced with responsiveness to the particular child. Key elements of each rocket must be identical to succeed. Every child is unique and must be understood as an individual. What works one day will likely not work another day. What works at 10 a.m. might not work at 10:05. There is high degree of certainty of outcomes in rockets. If you do and you follow the instructions very closely, things will work. In the case of raising children, uncertainty of outcomes remain. And last, success depends on blueprints in the case of rockets that direct both the development of separate parts and specific to the exact relationship which to assemble them. In the case of children, you can't separate the parts from the whole. Essence exists in the relationship between the different people, different experience, and different moments. Complicated problems can be solved using logic. We can code them. You cannot code complex problems. Complicated problems are deterministic and can be forecast. You cannot forecast complex problems. Most problems in organizations are complex. As soon as you have humans in the loop, your problems are usually complex. And we have the tendency to treating them as complicated, and this is a recipe for failure. The lesson here is that complex and complicated problems require very different approaches to solve them. And our first job is to make sure that we distinguish them. Let's talk about ideas. Majority of good ideas fail. If you look at the history of medicine, it has what we consider today modern medicine has existed for around 2,400 years. And for 2,400 years, doctors were convinced that they were helping their patients, and patients were confident that doctors would help them. According to David Goodell in his study and research, for the first 2,300, both were wrong. Doctors were doing more harm than good. Do you know what was the most common medical procedure until the 20th century? Most common medical procedure was bloodletting. Bloodletting is basically you open a vein to a person and you let them drain blood. This was used for tetanus, pneumonia, cancer, epilepsy, gangrene, tuberculosis, asthma, acne, cholera, diabetes, smallpox. Everything was treated by bloodletting. This ended, or at least started to end, in 1836 when a doctor in France, Dr. Pierre-Louis, did what we consider was the first control experiment in medicine. He took a group of patients, divided them into two groups, and to one group he used bloodletting, and to the other group he didn't do anything. And what he found was that bloodletting was not only not helping these patients, was actually killing them. Today, of course, we know that bloodletting wasn't working. But what do we learn from this? It is not trivial to know if an idea really works. And the other thing we learn is we can be wrong about something for 2,000 years. But we ask, well, maybe this is something that happened in the 19th century. It doesn't happen today. Well, that's actually not true. Qualpro is a company that measures ideas. And for the last 22 years, they measure 150,000 ideas that companies were convinced that were good ideas. And that's why they put them into production. What they found is that only 25% of those ideas actually worked. 53 didn't work but didn't hurt. And 22% actually make the process worse. The lesson here is that if we believe only in our intuition to judge whether an idea works or not, 75% of the time we will be wrong. This is an example that happened in Amazon. Amazon is a company that actually has from the very early days, has a very good culture of experimentation. Greg Linden, who used to be an employee there, came up with the idea that once you were buying something in Amazon and you have them in your car, before you checking out, the idea was that he wanted to show some recommendations based on what the person had in the shopping cart. The VP of marketing said, no, that's no way. That this actually might distract people away from checking out. This doesn't make any sense. So we need to stop the project. A lot of people agree with the VP of marketing because he was right. People would get distracted. But because Amazon is so good, has a so very good culture of experimentation, they decided that it was still worth it to actually experiment with this. Not only the experiment was a success, this represented hundreds of millions of dollars to Amazon. What we learn here is that no matter the idea, there will always be good arguments for and against it. The VP of marketing was right. People would get distracted, but at the end, the idea still worked. The important thing is not who can convince whom, but to experiment and to see if the idea works or not. What is the problem we have with the current culture in companies? If an idea works, we usually reward the individual, but if it fails, then we look for someone to blame. What's the problem? Well, 75% of good ideas will fail. We need the right incentives to experiment. And as Upton Sinclair said, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. If 75% of the time the ideas fail and we will look for someone to blame, there will be very small amount of chances that people will want to experiment. Who's the biggest enemy of innovation? This is what we call HIPO, standing for highest paid person opinion. This is when in a company you have a person that just listened to an idea and decided the idea will work or not. Usually this is the person that has the highest paid person in that meeting. And we call it HIPO. And we need to understand that this is the most dangerous person from innovation. We also need to remember that hippos, every year across Africa, hippos kill an estimated 500 people, making them the world's deadliest mammal after humans. Well, in the case of companies or organizations, hippos are also the world's deadliest the idea killers for innovation. So we need to remember, in order for us to innovate, we need to understand which idea works and which doesn't work. To prove that, we need to understand causality. And the gold standard to prove causality is to run randomized control experiments. But that's not enough. We need a culture that allows employees and people to fail, because in all majority of good ideas will fail. As Sir Con Robinson said, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you will never come up with something original. This brings us to the second topic. What is big data and how does this refer to ideas? Well, if we go to the definition of big data, and this started in 2001 by Doug Laney, he defined big data as the famous 3 Bs, velocity, variety, and volume. And then we went from 3 Bs to 4 Bs to 5 Bs to 6 Bs to 7 Bs to 10 Bs. We are seeing an exponential growth of definition of big data that start with the letter B. And I'm not claiming they're wrong, but they definitely add to this unnecessary complication. Big data is just data, and the objective is very simple, is to solve problems with data. That's all that matters. But of course, there's nothing new in solving problems with data. We've been solving problems with data for centuries now. Jon Snow, that by the way is not that Jon Snow, is a different Jon Snow. It's not the guy from the Game of Thrones. Jon Snow, using data from cholera cases in London, was able to find that the source of the outbreak was a public water pump on the street. So we actually been solving problems with data for centuries. In order for us to understand the power of data and the power of AI, we need to understand what is different now. Well, a few things are different now. The first one is true. We are generating a huge amount of data. But the amount of data is not necessarily what is important. What is important is, first, the cost of storing this data has dramatically gone down. Today, with less than $1,000, you can buy enough storage to store every single book that was written in human history. Something that would have cost you over $1 billion in 1987, and something that will likely cost less than $100 in a couple of years. On top of this, the cost of processing this data has also dramatically gone down. Today, with an Xbox One at home, has the same processing power than a supercomputer that the NSA bought back in 1999 that cost $67 million. And we use our Xbox for gaming. The Titan B cards, that are the cards that we use to train deep learning algorithms, have 3 times the capacity of the Earth simulator. The Earth simulator was a supercomputer that the Japanese government built in 2000, and until 2004 was the fastest supercomputer ever built in the history of humanity. Today, any person that can afford a $3,000 Titan B card has 3 times that processing power. So we need to remember and understand that big data is just data. But the low cost of data collection, storing, and processing creates a huge amount of new opportunities that before would have been impossible. But we need to remember that we need enough data to solve a problem while we need to focus on the problem. What is the connection between ideas and data? Well, ideas are ways to solve problems. With data, we can affect ideas that can also solve problems. That's the connection between the two. What is AI? What is artificial intelligence? Well, part of the problem with AI is a marketing term, and what used to be AI back in the 70s or 80s is no longer AI. So it's a definition that has been changing. But the vast majority of what is considered AI today is machine learning. What is machine learning? Machine learning are data learning algorithms. Basically, these algorithms can learn to generalize from data. What do we need in order to run an algorithm? We need data, what happened in the past, and we need a definition of success. All of us use algorithms. Let me show you an example for a machine learning algorithm. Imagine we have to create a model to automate loan approvals in a bank. And we have a history of bank loans entering into arrears and reimbursed by our customers. The algorithm will learn the patterns that differentiate those customers who pay well for those that more likely to default. So in a simplification of this, imagine that you have here this chart where you have the disposable income of the person, and you have the loan amount, and you have in green the history of all the customers that were able to repay your loans, and in red those that defaulted. The only thing that an AI algorithm will do is to learn this function. That's the only thing that these algorithms will do. Nothing else. That is what we consider artificial intelligence. Of course, any human can say, well, that was a very simple problem. This is because it's a simplification and you only have 2 dimensions. Imagine now you have 1,000 dimensions. An algorithm, as long as the algorithm has enough data, it will still be able to learn that function. In conventional programming, we have our brain that can think, and we can think and convert that thinking, that ideas, into rules. In machine learning, what we have is data, and we'll automatically learn those rules from that data. What is the power of machine learning? What is the power of AI? Is that to solve a problem, all we need is data and a success criteria. To show you an example of this, back in the 90s, there was a lot of companies spending money trying to solve the handwritten character recognition. This is for checks and for postal codes. This is a very important problem. And some of these companies were sold in hundreds of millions of dollars and spent years trying to solve this problem. Today, anybody can download for free a data set that has all these characters, and with 9 lines of code, you can solve this problem much more accurately than these companies that were sold for hundreds of millions of dollars back in the 90s were able to do it. But people think data is the new oil. Data is not the new oil. Data is the new code. We code using data, and that is the power of data. And of course, we can solve very important problems that before we couldn't solve. Today, algorithms are being used to detect cancer from medical images. And these algorithms are actually more accurate than the actual doctors. This is the power of AI. We're going to be seeing 2 more things today. A few other lessons learned specifically related to big data and AI, and a little bit about the future. Let me start with some of the lessons learned. For lesson number 1, for some world problems, relying on AI is the only option we have. Diabetic retinopathy is the leading cause of vision loss globally. 451 million people worldwide have diabetes. This is 4 times what it was in the 80s. And we expect this number to continue going up because of how diet is changing around the world. A third of those will develop diabetic retinopathy if they're not treated. If treated, blindness due to diabetic retinopathy is completely preventable. What is the problem that we have in the world? We only have 200,000 ophthalmologists. There's no way that these 200 ophthalmologists will be able to diagnose diabetic retinopathy in 451 million people. But today, thanks to AI, we have models that can detect and predict diabetic retinopathy. And these models are on par with ophthalmologists. Internally at Microsoft, we have built such a model, and we're using this model in production. Lesson number 2, we can get fooled by bias. Let me show you what I call the left-handed dilemma. Assuming the left-handed is independent of the probability of being today in the audience, the distribution of left-handed people in the room will be similar to the left-handed people in the population. So roughly 10% of you will be left-handed. But I have really bad news for left-handed people. In 1991, 2 researchers, Halpern and Koren from California State University and the University of British Columbia, published a research they took a random sample of people that died, asked the family members whether they were left-handed or right-handed. What they found was really disturbing. Left-handed people were dying 9 years younger than right-handed people. If this was true, being left-handed would be like smoking 120 cigarettes per day. So really bad for left-handed people. But the good news is that there is a problem with the study, and the study assumes that the distribution of left-handed people is stable over time. And this is not true. For many years, there was a discrimination against left-handed people. And parents would force their kids to be right-handed. I know that because my grandfather was one of them. My grandfather was actually forced to be right-handed. Eventually, people stopped doing this. And what happened was you see an artificial increase in the left-handed population in the world. This artificial increase is the one that gives us the illusion that left-handed people are dying younger than right-handed people, when it's not true. What's the problem from a machine learning and AI and data perspective? The vast majority of data we collect has biases. If we do not understand them and take them into account, our data models will not be accurate, will not be correct. If you use the data from people, you will see, the model will tell you that, and you are a life insurance company, the model will tell you that you need to charge life insurance, higher life insurance to left-handed people because they will die younger, when in reality, that's not the case. Lesson number 3, we forget correlation or predictive power does not imply causation. If you look at the ice cream sales and drownings in the US, you see that both of these time series are highly correlated. And this is not by just random chance. There's a good reason for this. And because of both of them have a confounding effect that is temperature. When temperature goes up, you have more people going to the beach, more probability of drownings, and at the same time, you have more ice cream sales. But of course, if tomorrow I decide to ban ice cream sales, the only thing that will happen is this correlation will break, nothing else. The problem is that majority of people do not understand the difference between correlation and causation. Gallup did a survey a few years ago where they asked a very simple question. Do you believe correlation implies causation? 64% of Americans answered yes. 28% said no, 8% were undecided. And I'm not worried about the undecided, I'm worried about the 64%. What's the problem is that we cannot observe causality. We learn from correlations. When you go to an elevator, you usually want the door to close, you usually click on this. Well, I can tell you that there's a study that claims that majority of these closed doors actions are just placebos. They don't do anything, but your brain will tell you, because they're correlated, that you click there and suddenly the door closed. Well, the door will have closed anyway. In fact, for majority of the cases, that doesn't do anything. We learn as humans, we learn from correlations. We cannot observe causation. Let me show you an example here. A few years ago, Andrew Francis and Hugo Melon published a paper where they found the relationship between wedding expenses and marriage duration. The more you spend in your wedding, the more probability of divorce you have. But in the paper, they were very clear that they're not implying causation. They're just implying predictive power. Well, how did CNN report this? Want a happy marriage, have a big cheap wedding. And CNN wasn't alone. The case for cheap weddings, for a marriage that lasts, try a big cheap wedding. We need to understand wedding cost is correlated with marriage duration. Wedding cost is not causing marriage duration. There's a big difference between these two. The only newspaper that got it right was the Wall Street Journal. Will a cheap wedding help your marriage? A lesson in causation. Lesson here is we have to understand that correlation and predictive power does not imply causation. And more importantly, to realize that most people don't understand the difference. Let me show you a few examples of our work. As soon as COVID hit, we put a team together to work across the world helping on COVID. We work with different governments, with different institutions. We work as part of the modeling team with the Department of Health, try to get the best data we could to help understand the pandemic and to help understand not only the pandemic, but the type of policies, which ones were working and which ones they didn't work. We work in many countries, including Colombia, with researchers to help them better understand the data. We also been working in SIDS. SIDS is sudden infant death syndrome. SIDS is the number one cause of death for babies between 1 month and 1 year old, and roughly 4,000 children die of SIDS in the US every year. SIDS is when your baby dies and doctors don't know why. We've been working with Seattle Children's Hospital, with the University of Virginia, and with Harvard Medical Schools, using big data and machine learning to try to better understand SIDS and the causes. We have published 5 papers on these, including an explanation on why 22% of these cases were caused by smoking while pregnant. Our study was the first one to show that even 1 cigarette per day doubled the chances of SIDS. On the humanitarian action space, we've been working with the Carter Center using machine learning models to automatically find armed conflict in near real time. This helps the Carter Center to do a much faster response to every problem and every situation. We're working with NOAA, where we have underwater sensors and we have AI models to try to accurately track beluga whales and develop effective recovery strategies. Our models are really accurate to try to detect belugas. Belugas are an amazing animal, and we use these models to help NOAA better monitor the situation that they have. We work a lot with satellite data. One of the projects that we have was here in Colombia, where we work with the Wildlife Conservation Society to build maps for conservation plans for the Orinoquia. These models train on top of satellite data and convert these satellite data into maps like the one that you have here on the right. Also, using satellite data, we were working with ICIMOD, that is an organization that works tracking the effect of glacial melting on the top of the world. We use satellite data to track these glaciers and to monitor them. To close this, let me talk a little bit about the future and why I'm optimistic. Bill Clinton once said, "Intelligence, ability, and willingness to work are evenly distributed around the world, but opportunities are not." The reason why I'm optimistic is a little bit about the opportunities. The first one is the opportunity to learn. A few years ago, Peter Norvig and Sebastian Thurn, that are among the best AI professors in the world, they teach AI as part of the curriculum in Stanford. They decided to run this experiment where they massively opened their course to anyone in the world that had access to a computer. This was a huge success. 160,000 students around the world signed up to do the course, from Afghanistan to Colombia. What was amazing was at the end of the course, this included their own Stanford students. And what was amazing was at the end of the course, they took an exam. And the best 400 students, there was no one from Stanford. What this means is that there's a huge amount of people around the world that if we give them the opportunity to learn, they will take it and they will learn how to use AI. It would have taken more than 200 years to teach these 160,000 students for Stanford, and it took them only 6 months. Today, thanks to Khan Academy, edX, Udacity, and Coursera, there's a huge amount of the best courses with the best professors in the world that people can learn this type of technology for free. When I joined Microsoft, we would spend a significant effort bringing our professors to teach these type of courses to our employees. Today, we realize that the best way to teach them is using these online courses. These are the best professors, and they're also free. Second one is opportunity to access data processing power, opportunity to access a computer. I was born and raised in Uruguay. I had the luck that my parents bought me a computer when I was very young, and I was able to learn how to code thanks to this. But among my classmates and friends, my brothers and I were likely the only ones that had that chance. Well, today, every single child in Uruguay has access to a computer thanks to the program One Laptop Per Child. And we have seen these programs around the world. And these are very small computers, but we need to understand that they are more powerful than some of the supercomputers that the governments were using in the 80s and early 90s. So even though they're not looking powerful, they actually are very powerful computers. And today, more and more children around the world are learning how to code thanks to this type of programs. Opportunity to access and process data. 10, 15 years ago, unless you were working in a university or an institution that actually had data, it would have been impossible for people to use machine learning or to train models because they wouldn't have access to data. Today, thanks to open data movement around the world and thanks to the open source tools, all the based AI tools are open source and people can use them for free against open data sets to train and use AI and machine learning. All the best tools in the world, the same tools that you use in companies like Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Google, all of those tools are open source and anybody in the world can use them for free. The secret weapons of these companies and for innovation does no longer rely on software. It is on data, and majority of the data is available for people to use from an open data perspective. This is creating a significant opportunity around the world. Last but not least, the opportunity to make a difference. Jeffrey Hammerbacher, who was one of the first data scientists in Facebook, once said, "The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to get people click on ads, and that sucks." And he was right. Even today, the best minds of my generation are making sure that you click on their ads. But what is important on this is that predicting which children have higher chances of dying of SIDS versus predicting which customer will click on an ad, even though these two programs cannot be further apart, from a pure data and machine learning perspective, both of these programs are the same problem. If you have people in your company that are really good to make sure that people click on your ads, you can use that same knowledge to solve much more important problems. 6.4 million children worldwide die before the 5 years of age. Over 1 billion children worldwide are living in poverty. 785 million people have significant physical or mental disability, including around 5% of children. 2.1 billion people lack access to safety managed drinking water. And each year, diarrhea kills 500,000 people under the age of 5. A significant proportion of diarrheal disease can be prevented through safe drinking water, adequate sanitation, and hygiene. In our smartphones, we have more processing power than the one that was needed to put a man on the moon. There are very important problems out there that can and should be solved with data. We no longer have excuses. Thank you very much. I'll take your questions now.
Juan, muchísimas gracias. Estamos aquí.
Juan, thank you very, very much. We are here astonished with the proposals and your ideas presented. We have a series of questions. These are all very, very interesting questions. The first one obviously has to do with machine learning, creativity, and the role that COVID-19 plays, obviously, because we know that in your school, well, you're working hand in hand with children, specifically in coding and writing code. You're being a teacher and teaching children how to code. Would you like to tell us a bit about that? Rosita, should I answer in Spanish or English? Well, you've been doing it in English. There's interpreting available, so perhaps you can reply in Spanish.
So two things. I think coding is extremely important, not just because I think coding is a way for people to get amazing skills, but because also is a great way for children to understand logic and to understand that they can do more things than the ones that they can think. It's also amazing how fast I have been impressed teaching kindergarten and first and second grade children, how fast kids learn how to code. I always say the same example, like my daughter, Antonia, is 8 years old now. And she speaks English much better than I will ever speak English. And even though she only had 8 years and I've been learning English for the last likely 40 or 38 years. And the reason that happens is because when we are young, there is a stage in life where the brain can adapt much faster and learn languages, correct? This is why we learn as humans. We learn languages in 3-4 years. We can have a very good understanding of language. By the year when you are 8, you have a much better understanding of languages. The same thing happens in computer science. Computer science programming is not different than a language. It's actually a much simpler language than learning Spanish or English, because there's no irregularities in coding. Is first, the amount of the size of the language is much smaller, and there's no irregularities. And children will actually learn that extremely fast. So I do think that it's extremely important for children to learn coding. It teaches how to use logic, but more importantly, it's very natural for them to learn a language.
Muchísimas gracias, Juan.
Thank you very much, Juan. Then the following question that's being asked, and that I think reflects some of the ideas that we have about AI, is the following. Are there dangers in AI, really? What risks would AI mean to humanity if we were to continue with this process of using algorithms and of perhaps placing AI to the forefront of different fields, such as medicine or other processes that have really to do directly with the fragility of human life? I will answer one question in English and one question in Spanish to be a bit more democratic. So I will reply to this one in Spanish. So yes, well, regarding, and as I spoke in my talk, there's several series of factors. AI will certainly be able to learn to generalize from the data we have, right? So if the data that we have are wrong, for example, they have a bias, as we saw, for example, that study that I showed of left-handed and right-handed people. Well, these models will certainly learn from these data, and they will be able to generalize depending on that. However, they will be wrong. So yes, there is a certain amount of risks in terms of creating these models when we don't have correct data. And as all technology of human history, all these technologies can be used for good, as we are doing to help humanity, but obviously these technologies can be used to do wrong, right? So we must be very careful, because nowadays, for example, many of these technologies are being used as well in armies. They're being used, meaning, of course, unfortunately, there are many things from AI that could be used to do wrong, but that should be taken into account, including in those cases that technology is being used to do wrong. We must be very careful, and we also must be responsible when creating these algorithms to be sure that, well, they're doing what we want them to do, and to code them and understand them, and that obviously takes time. So algorithms think, meaning can they have development process, standalone development process, whereas our algorithms can only do what you have as an input?
Generalize from data. The idea of thinking is something that we as humans cannot put as part of a logic. So what we know is that what we do is these algorithms can learn how to generalize from data for the specific project, for the specific problem we have, and generalize from that. Like we saw the example on the bank, that the algorithm can learn now how to distinguish if the person will pay or not the loan. So an algorithm can do that because it's generalizing from the data. whether algorithms are really thinking, the answer is no. They're not thinking. They're just like all these algorithms are doing are just multiplying matrices. Like in very simple way, this is very simple of operations of multiplication of matrices. That's all these algorithms are doing. But because we have data and we learn how to generalize from data, we can actually solve problems that from a human perspective, it would take a lot of intelligence to solve them. But behind the scenes, the only thing these algorithms are doing is just multiplication of matrices, nothing else.
Gracias. Y tengo
Thank
una-
you. And I have a following set of questions that I will summarize into one. And these are related to evaluation of the good ideas. So could you please perhaps provide a much more depth on how that evaluation is carried out, what exactly happens with data in this case? And the other one is always a good idea equivalent to a good creative idea? All right, I'll reply to the first question first. So as we just saw in my presentation, the majority of good ideas in terms of if this idea is solving a question or not, well, most of these ideas, be them creative or not, well, most of these ideas fail. A fundamental part is to understand what part of these ideas work and which don't. To be able to do that, we must really understand causality. And we must be able to test if that idea works or not. And the way we do this is to have a controlled experiment to understand causation. For example, this is an idea. If children will learn more or less from a subject between doing A or B, so we can split the children in a random way so that for some groups we apply a solution, to the other group we don't apply that same solution, and then at the end of the year, at the academic year, we can evaluate, right? That is the way in which we can test an idea. It's by using these controlled experiments. So in regards to the creative part, to be able to have ideas, we must be able to understand the creative part. And in that case, we humans are very good at this. We can have a lot of creative ideas, but this isn't sufficient. It's not sufficient for the idea to be creative, for the idea to work. It's very interesting, this ethical dimension that I think opens up as of the bias that you've mentioned and the bias with which an investigation of data starts off with. Yes, can you please comment a bit on that? Yes, well, of course, when we use these data and when we use these or make these models, we have an ethical component that is quite significant, and that's why it's very important to know what can and what can't we do from an ethical standpoint. So in this sense, it is certainly important to ask ourselves these questions because many of these, to test many of these things, we need to take into account this component. Actually, many of the experiments nowadays, even at a medical, in the medical field, cannot be done due to an ethical barrier. So many of these experiments, we know that in the long term would save lives. We cannot carry them out or won't be able to be carried out for a good reason because we, for example, cannot experiment on human beings. However, we are using, well, today we know that many of these procedures, like as bloodletting, wouldn't happen today, and many of the procedures that doctors use today are perhaps not necessarily working. However, it's not easy to be able to test if they work or not because of these limitations. Now, an example is, for example, we've never done a controlled experiment about, for example, if smoking actually creates cancer or not. We know this now because we've done other type of experiments, but at a human level, we cannot force a human being to smoke or not smoke. All right, and when you say that we will teach children coding from the earliest stages, at the end of the day, are we teaching the children of the world to create artificial intelligence? Would there be perhaps a topic in terms of individuals creating those AI algorithms that we teach children to code? Well, coding doesn't necessarily mean this. What coding is at its essence is that, well, we have ideas that that we as human beings transform as logic, and coding is basically the way in which we represent that logic in a computer, right? So I think that's a first step. Yes, that's a first step, correct. And it's a fundamental step. Now, of course, algorithms of AI, well, those are the same algorithms that people and human beings can build in terms of coding. Algorithms of AI are not different to the coding, that the understanding that we have of coding. Those are the algorithms. Then we can use those algorithms against data. That's the part that would differentiate, meaning what is different in AI in comparison to coding or standard coding is that both are algorithms, but some algorithms, well, we have the human being mind, or the human mind that writes these rules, so that these rules then later learn from data and can analyze data. Now, the second component, the second part of AI is the part in which these algorithms learn from data in an automatic manner. So I do fundamentally believe that to be able to use an algorithm in AI, we must first understand coding. Not necessarily are these two things, meaning we will still have coding as an important component to the human brain. In perhaps 50, 100 years, we will continue to code. However, we will also have a greater use of AI, certainly. Juan, I imagine that, well, when you propose this idea, and when you propose this idea, well, in Microsoft, well, the imaginary that we have about Microsoft is that Microsoft is a huge hardware production company that has, a brilliant mind, but a mind that is focused in profiting. So how does your good idea integrate to a company like this? Well, I think all companies have a social responsibility component. All companies have, for example, philanthropic programs. However, the difference with this program that I'm leading is that, well, what we realized is that the world today, well, great majority of people that have experience in AI work for organizations such as Microsoft, Facebook, Google, and very little people from AI work in different programs or programs external to these. So if we want AI to be used in the world for good, it's not enough that these companies donate money, because organizations outside of the tech industry cannot really hire and cannot pay the type of salaries that these people in the tech industry have or earn. So there is a huge gap between these organizations that are working for the good, for example, Free Cash Center or hospitals, for example, and those institutions today don't have access to the type of people that work, for example, in the AI sectors. And the reason why it's important that these organizations such as Microsoft work in these areas to be able to do something that these organizations couldn't do. At some point in the world, this will be adapted, and we will certainly have people that have this type of skills outside of the tech industry. But nowadays, that's not the case. And that's the reason why it's important that organizations such as us help the world in being able to use these technologies. In the case of Microsoft, this is very much aligned to our mission, which is helping, or actually making it happen, that all human beings in the world can use technology to live better. So this is very much aligned to our mission. Rosita, you are muted. Yes. And do you also, so you manage this program for the world? Yes, that's correct. This is a very broad question, but it's the following. And the question is,
inteligencia artificial can solve. Las preguntas más importantes.
the most important questions.
One of the most pressing, like we saw with diabetic retinopathy, is that you have a significant amount of people in the world that will not be able to access medical services or a medical doctor because there's not enough doctors for helping them, particularly in many countries around the world. But around those countries, everybody, like not everybody, but majority of the people in those countries have access to smartphones. So if you can use technology, even for diagnostics, to help with understanding whether a patient has, for example, we're working in leprosy now. Even though people don't think about leprosy, there's still over millions of people living with leprosy today. And majority of them live in India and in Brazil. And it's impossible, like they live in very remote areas. If you are diagnosed for leprosy, all the treatment will be for free. Leprosy can be completely cured if you take those treatments. But the difficult part here is to get that diagnostics because there's not enough doctors. So if you can use these models that run in cheap smartphones and use them worldwide, you can make a huge difference in the health of people that would have been impossible for them to access medical doctors. So I think one of the most pressing opportunities for using AI is in the health space, and specifically in the health space in areas where the majority of the people do not have access to doctors.
Claro. Un tema de justicia ahí. Mira, tienes que terminar.
So this is definitely related to justice. You must finish off by answering the question about the title of your talk, how to create new ideas. Well, I think what's most fundamental for me, Rosita, about generating or creating new ideas is that we must understand that we must give ourselves the permission to fail or have ideas that fail. I know that you in schools are much more advanced in most education around the world, but most education provided in the world, well, we teach children since very early ages to be right. Either things work or don't work, right? That's what we teach them. And since very early ages, we don't really teach children that failure is part of the innovative process, and it's part of the creative process as well. Part of the creative process is having lots of ideas and knowing that actually most of the ideas that we have will fail, and to be able to experiment and actually see what are the ideas that are going to fail and which aren't. And we must remove this idea from our minds that we actually know what will work and what won't. We need to remove from our minds that we need to have this certainty about an idea working or not without experimenting, and we rather should understand that to be able to innovate, we must have a lot of ideas. And within those multiple ideas, we must know and we must be able to measure which are good ideas that work and which aren't good ideas that don't work, and to keep on advancing. And I think that's what is most fundamental when we actually are able to use ideas. Juan, I think I could stay talking for hours with you. We are absolutely in depth with you in terms of providing more time for your conference. We must close off this session because we have attendees that will attend tech and education workshops. So thank you, Juan. We've learned a lot from you. You are a permanent guest in our school. You know how dear we are to your family, to your daughters and sons and your grandchildren. So yes, we're definitely in debt with you, and we owe you more time to be able to share more with you. Thank you, Rosita. Well, we must say goodbye to Juan, unfortunately. So we will close this session. And we'd like to remind all attendees that the global call for ideas is open until the 31st of May. This will be an experience for the whole of humanity to seek significant ideas after this very difficult time of the COVID-19 pandemic. So on behalf of TED, the School Colegia Hacienda Los Alcaparros, and the Creative Brain Initiative, we want to thank everyone who has supported this process of organizing these events. And we'd now like to say farewell and thank you for joining us.
Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta conferencia del coloquio El Cerebro Creativo y TEP. No olvide visitar nuestra página web www.alcaparros.edu.co y conocer más sobre el llamado global por ideas creativas presentada hoy. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos.